Current time is now 7:26 p.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. It's time for our Thursday's Made in Korea, and joining us in the studio, well, look who we have here. The professor from Seoul National University, John DeMoya, but he's also from Philly. And our teams have met in the first round of the NBA playoffs. Good to see you, Professor.
Thank you for having me, and the first game will be Sunday morning Seoul time, of which I am very aware.
Right during the station break, I said, it looks like we're going to be enemies for the time being. He said, what are you talking about? He said, the Knicks are not even a challenge. Embiid,
I did not say that.
Embiid came at the right time. Let's just put it out there. What are they running on like an 8-game winning streak, and then the recent win is number 9?
They have not lost since he returned. I expect that streak to continue.
Although the Knicks have won 3 games out of the 4 times that they met this season.
I acknowledge this.
But playoffs is different.
Sure.
Playoffs, and the Knicks will always break my heart during playoffs. It's always been like that. We're not going to talk about the history of basketball, but recently we had the general elections here in South Korea, and so I think it's appropriate to ask more questions concerning Korea's electoral history. We're going to talk about South Korea's first president. He is often known as Syngman Rhee. This is kind of the English way. Here in Korea, we call him Lee Syngman.
Exactly.
Right? What were the circumstances of the first election in 1948? Although we're going to go more into the elections next week. And what was Lee's legacy? First and foremost, we did mention briefly who Lee Syngman was when we talked about some of the original members of
the Shanghai Provisional Government.
Yeah, the Provisional Government and so forth. And he was also mentioned before elsewhere. But now he's coming in as the main figure to talk about here. And I feel like when we look at I grew up in the United States.
Sure.
And when I was learning world history, Lee Syngman is always going to be taught as just the first president of South Korea. I think there's much more to this. Who was Lee Syngman before he became famous as an activist, though?
He captures nicely, in a little bit of, like I said last week with Kim Gu, the nice transition from late Chosun into just before the colonial period. Born in 1875, I believe he has some kind of a traditional, I hate to use this word, so I'll put it in quotation marks, but Confucian education in the sense that he probably learned classical things. But he attends some sort of Christian school, I believe, Methodist, starts to learn English. So he's one of those Koreans who is very rapidly in the late 19th century transitioning from what would have been a long-term, older classical Chinese education to again, maybe in quotation marks, but a sort of modern, starting to learn other languages and recognizing that as the 19th century comes to a close, that Korea is threatened by Japan and that maybe he can use his education to do political things to help change the future of the country.
Yeah, and I feel like, especially at that time, right, when you're not going to see a whole lot of people who have the kind of educational background as he is.
No, those opportunities are rare.
Oh, absolutely. And the fact that, he's been to the United States, and we'll talk about that later on, but he has definitely a very different background compared to the average Koreans of his era. But what kind of activities did he participate in as part of the Independence Club?
Yeah. I guess a lot of things that, depending on how you cast them, might be seen by someone in the opposition as political radicalism, but on his side, in terms of being an activist on the part of independence, journalism, pushing for reforms within the very late Chosun government, which would be Ko Jong right at the end of his technical period of rule. Things that are far enough radical that he gets put in prison in 1899. And to be honest, preparing for today, I had to think about it because I always thought, I knew he'd been in prison and it makes you think automatically Japanese colonialism. But this is a good decade before formal colonialism. So he's clearly upsetting certain parties in the then Chosun government. And that perhaps he's pushing for reform that's, too fast, too radical. Whatever he's doing, it's definitely getting the attention of authorities.
Yeah, so you're telling me that he participated as part of the Independence Club, even before the Japanese colonial time.
Yeah, and I take it that he's very anti-Japanese. He knows that pressure is coming. But I would imagine that what gets him in trouble is he's not against the existing Korean government, but he wants it to reform and do things that presumably parties in the government government are not willing to make changes that rapidly at the pace he and others are calling for.
Does he want it the American way?
I wouldn't go that far because he has yet. We're jumping ahead a little bit. He will be going to the United States shortly, but he definitely is aware of a lot of the new ideas that are out there. I mean, if you, again, to go into the bigger really quickly, the bigger to the period, the Cabo reforms, even some things I tell my students all the time, people forget that Korea, as part of the Cabo reforms, not just legally, but culturally, the first electrification is introduced in Seoul, which means Toksogung Palace gets electrified, but you forget that this is not later.
Yeah.
There is a telephone system, again, briefly small, it's like maybe a couple diplomatic missions in one of the palaces. But these changes are to a government that has, to a country that has roughly, 500-600 years of stability. These are radical changes at the end of the 19th century.
But you know what's ironic about all this is you told me about his educational background,
sure.
Right? That he, like you said in quotation marks, Confucian.
Right, and then very
ideas.
quickly going into a quote-unquote modern education insofar as it's Methodist,
which which would kind of generally make you think that he's going to be more traditional in a sense.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right,
okay.
and change doesn't kind of go hand in hand here, but you're talking about someone all of a sudden who had this kind of education is now looking for radical changes within the country. Another thing that I'm learning for the first time here is the fact that he went to prison, as you mentioned just briefly here, from 1899 to 1904.
Yeah.
And again, this is before the Japanese
it's right on the
times.
edge of, and you can feel the culture influence coming in. But yes, it has not formally taken place yet.
Why did he go to prison?
Again, I want to be careful here. He definitely, at least at some point, advocates for some activities that are against Kojong specifically. I imagine, again, that I want to be careful here, not anti-government so much as let's make changes within the Korean government to get it better prepared to presumably curtail the possibility of what came.
Because he was always thinking, look, I mean, it's inevitable. It's going to come. I think Japan is going to come in there. They're going to try to take over. And so we need to prepare for this, is what you're saying.
But again, presumably doing activities that are directed against the government of Kojong, I imagine that's what gets him put into prison.
I mean, that doesn't look good, right? I mean, when you're basically going, look, because he's also the last emperor of Korea, you would assume that you're never going to go in there thinking you're going to be the last emperor of Korea.
No.
All right, this is going to continue on according to what Kojong thinks. It's worked for hundreds of years. It's going to continue on. And all of a sudden you have this guy who never, ever before has anyone questioned the ways of the king. And he's going to go and talking about radical ideas. That's going to put you in prison.
It's going to get attention at the very least. And in this case, the wrong kind of attention.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We've talked about how he's had a very different educational background. Where did he study while abroad and with whom?
Okay, sure. This is where it gets fun, and I'll try to do the brief, but I'll get the most important story. He does a BA at George Washington, and because of his later history as president of Korea, all these institutions like to claim him. He does, after George Washington, an MA at Harvard. And then he does a PhD at Princeton. And this is where he gets the interesting story in that he is the quote-unquote personal student of Woodrow Wilson. This was when Wilson is at Princeton before he becomes U.S. president. And there are lots of stories about him from having been on campus because he lives over at the Princeton Theological Seminary, but he actually does get the degree from the department over at the university. But there are all kinds of stories about, if I can tell these stories, these are purely apocryphal, let me be clear, purely word of mouth. No one's ever confirmed it. But supposedly he liked to ride his bicycle around. And the story I heard when I was a grad student was that he would ride it in a figure eight while he was thinking, and he would just do these like circles. And so the Korean students at PTS, the Theological Seminary, like to say that he had a reputation of being not the most studious in the library kind of person, but kind of a thinking, roaming around on his bicycle. And so there's this myth of him, again, sort of riding around in this green campus on his bike, happily kind of thinking to himself. And I should have also mentioned, and this is that he writes a dissertation that is still available if anyone wants to find it. I'm sure they can, through email, get a copy of it. That's essentially on the policy of Korean neutrality as influenced at the end of the 19th century going in. So what I mean is he's writing about current Korean politics right at the time. Woodrow Wilson is his advisor. This kind of lends him a certain kind of authority in terms of later on he can use this, of course, to sort of say, look, I was already thinking about the possibilities of a Korean government down the road.
And of all people, his advisor being soon to be, well, later to be the president, Woodrow Wilson.
Yes. But also someone who has now more recently suffered a question to his reputation because of his racial policies.
Yes.
Okay, so exactly. In more recent years, the Princeton has dropped the Woodrow Wilson School name, so that's not accident. Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, former President Lee Syngman is also...
This is why I'm...
Also, it's the center of a lot of controversies, and we're going to talk about all that and more. And we're kind of putting it out here because Professor De Moya, alma mater of former President Lee Syngman here, has...
and I can say without getting into it too much, because we also need to anticipate talking about what's tomorrow, which is the anniversary of the April Revolution, so we can bring that up at the end. But so really quickly, because sometimes I'm in contact with the Princeton Korea group, and there are still members who very actively pay respects to the grave and things like this. And I don't want to get them in any trouble. They're wonderful people, but I receive the emails and I'm usually busy at that time of year. But I have been invited to visit his grave, and I'm usually busy.
How come President Biden's not inviting me to anything? He's Syracuse, right?
I've gotten to meet some interesting Koreans over the course of the years because of this connection.
Princeton, obviously, one of the more elite universities out there. Where did he go after 1919? This is an interesting kind of part in his the early days of Lee Syngman.
Sure. This is when it leads us into his period with the Shanghai Provisional Government. I've forgotten the exact date, but after Shanghai, he will have to leave to go to, he leaves to go to Hawaii. But the interesting thing about this, and it links with last week, is he is technically president of Shanghai Provisional Government. I think it's 19 until 25. He is impeached at a certain point in time for, depending on what sources you read, abuse of his authority. I've seen the word embezzlement come up occasionally. But so, in a weird, interesting way, it kind of prefigures a little bit what happens later, where he will also, again, be the first president of South Korea, have a great deal of power for about 12 years, and then run into trouble again. So he definitely has this forward-thinking, progressive, I want to change the country, but he tends to rely very heavily on his own authority, and this upsets his fellow politicians numerous times.
We've learned over time in history, with people with radical ideas who want power, it leads to...
It tends to trouble if there's no checks on them once they attain the position where they can do what they want.
Yes, absolutely.
This is not just Korea, sure.
No, this is not just Korea. And we have, a certain state up north that kind of started out that way as well. And so this is a kind of a foreshadowing to what's going to happen. We'll talk about this, but... We talked about the Shanghai provincial government, the importance of this, but when we often talk about the role that or the symbol that the provincial government had and the independence movement, we talked about Paekbum, right?
Yes,
Kim Gu, and his name pops up a lot. Not so much so with Lee Syngman, although you mentioned he kind of had the role as the president of the Shanghai provincial government.
Precisely because of this impeachment situation.
Because of this. We talked about Kim Gu. What kind of relationship did he maintain with the other members, including Kim Gu?
I think I will describe, because I'm not an expert on this, but given the impeachment and given the moving back and forth, I would describe it as collegial, but nonetheless marked with some tensions, again, around issues of how much we collaborate. Lee Syngman definitely seemed to want to be more taken on his own word and trusted in his own authority. And this, so I would describe it as collegial, but also sometimes with some tensions, which is both fair for this period, but also fair for later on.
There's a saying, they say in politics, right? Number one can never be friends with number two. All right. There are people who say, well, the number one, he or she has the power and just going to transition the power to number two. It doesn't work that way. Apparently, there's always going to be this rivalry. Would you say there was some sort of rivalry? Because the way that people speak about, there's Lee Syngman and then Kim Gu, the way that it's taught, these two individuals are taught, they're taught in a certain way, different way, depending on who teaches them this,
absolutely.
And then they'll take a certain side.
Absolutely.
They'll say, well, Kim Gu was the better of the two, or someone will say, well, no, Lee Syngman was,
Sure.
the better of the two, and that he had shown a greater leadership.
And to link to this is why I mentioned last week that in some Korean studies circles, forums, endowed chairs in the United States, I can't think of any off the top of my head, Lee Syngman chairs, but there are a number, particularly the prominent one at Harvard, that are named after Kim Gu, which, again, as you indicated, suggests that different people have different takes. And then the other take, which we brought up last week, but he can hit it again just to remind people, is that the suspicious circumstances of Kim Gu's death, there are repeated rumors that individual came on behalf of Lee Syngman or people who worked for Lee Syngman.
Right.
This, I think, is still somewhat controversial, but that story is out there.
Yeah, I mean...
So, yeah, that would indicate not a good relationship.
What was his name? Something Toohey.
Yes, I'm forgetting, but,
yeah.
But the individual responsible for the actual killing.
Because the reason... And I know we might be getting sidetracked with this, because that person was eventually pardoned or released way earlier than he should have been, and because of this, there was a lot of... conspiracy theories.
There are still any number of rumors.
Yeah. All right. So when and why did he return to Korea? Because again, we've talked about how he has a lot of background in traveling abroad, spending time in the United States and things like that.
Sure. He comes really quickly just before that to D.C., I think in 39 or 40 with, well, the warriors, Japan's already at war with China, but obviously this leads into the American involvement in the war. So he's in D.C. to lobby American government officials as much as he can because he kind of anticipates what might be coming. And then that leads to the return to Korea in the fall of 45, now wanting to position himself, having been away, but having had the Shanghai role, having been lobbying leaders. He wants to show himself as the guy who for basically 2 to 3 decades has been abroad and has now returned to be the legitimate, in his eyes, ruler of a Korea, not knowing that division is coming, and of course realizing that there are other competitors, some alongside him, some who will soon come to the north. But again, he's trying to position himself.
We're going to talk more extensively about the election
Sure.
in 1948, the first Korean election, right? What kind of president did he become with the 1948 election? Very briefly.
Yeah, sure. He, at least then, is the transition point from the American military government. It's smooth in that sense. The division, of course, is not smooth, but nonetheless.
Right.
There's the famous picture of South Korean independence in August 48. In front of the GJK building, which is now kind of weird and ironic, but he's sitting there with MacArthur and John Hodge, so definitely a symbolic, smooth transition. Mm-hmm. And leading into prior to the Korean War, this is where it's, again, sort of you get the both sides of him. Positive, he is ruling at least the southern part of the peninsula and making the transition from the military government, not knowing that the war is coming. Negative, he definitely, not just with what we've talked about previously with Cheju, but with other things bubbling up in small little rebellions in the south, 48, 49, he's putting them down.
Yeah.
So he's already showing hands of being heavily anti-communist, in his eyes, solidifying the country, but from the historical perspective now, perhaps labeling any opposition politically as communist, when that might not be the case.
That history of calling your opponent communist actually sometimes still goes on today.
Yes, precisely.
And so the history repeats itself. Tradition is kept alive time to time, which I'm not going to get into details.
No, but in
this.
South Korea, as opposed to another place, it had a particular resonance in 48 and 49.
Definitely. What's the significance of the year 1956?
Sure. 56 is technically when he will run again, but the reason this is interesting is, as this happened later with another Korean president, there was originally, I believe, in the Korean constitution, a 2-term limit, so he had to lobby to get that in there, and there we're on new territory in the sense that he's now been 48, 52, 56, partly the continuity because of the war. But then when that takes him through 60, he is consistently being democratically elected. But you're getting the sense of that he's taking this as almost a fait accompli. This should be done. Of course, I'm the president. We'll go through the process. But he's, I think, by 56 and 60, not taking it perhaps as seriously as he should in the sense of genuinely engaging with the public. And this is where he's getting the reputation of, I remember as a grad student seeing, I've forgotten the name of the series, but it was from the time, and it showed a picture of him in the room. And our teacher said, oh yeah, he was kind of seen as a grandfatherly figure, not necessarily in touch, like a halabaji was nice, but increasingly out of touch a little bit in terms of his engagement with the public.
Let's talk about, this is really the reason why we're talking about this, because tomorrow is a certain anniversary, April 19th, 1960. There's a significant movement that happens here in South Korea. Let's talk about what happened in April 1960 and where Lee Syngman ended up spending the remaining days after 1960.
Sure. It starts with him actually being successfully elected along with his vice presidential candidate in March of 1960, but the percentages are so outrageous. I think it's in the range of like 87 or 90% in his favor. And this is, I should mention, when his two opposition candidates one passed away and one was labeled as a communist. So like no opposition, 90%. People are very suspicious. They very quickly find a high school student who has been killed. And this grows from the discovery of that body in early April to street demonstrations to a couple weeks later, he's out of power. And he's very surprised.
And that was actually the very first sort of pro-democracy movements that you're seeing, which is going to foreshadow into what happens later on, and which is why Lee Syngman is always going to be known as the first president of South Korea. But he is also going to be known as person who was democratically ousted by the people because, again, the abuse of the power that he had, and there was clearly borderlining, I don't want to use that word, but
that 90% figure is now generally seen as heavily influenced by extra ballots showing up in the box.
There you go. Professor De Moya, as always, thank you very much for your coverage. Best of luck to you and the playoffs. And next week, we'll see what happens. But we're going to talk more about what happened in 1948. Until then, we'll see you next week.
Thanks very much.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang Radio application, or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.